November of this year was one dominated by one feeling for the Democrats: victory. They won in historic margins practically everywhere, winning both the governor races in Virginia and New Jersey, the mayorship in New York, and even breaking the Republican supermajority in Mississippi's state Senate, replacing the feeling of aimlessness and despair that 2020 had left them with one of hope and optimism. Until the government shutdown ended.
Suddenly, everyone was brought back down to earth as the Democrats went from a high point back down into infighting. But why did this happen? Now, to understand everything that's happening right now, we have to answer three questions. First, what is a government shutdown? Second, why is this one different than all the other ones? And finally, what are the two key voices shaping the Democrat response? First, what is a government shutdown?
According to USAFacts, a government shutdown is when Congress fails to pass or the president refuses to sign a spending bill to fund the federal government. This results in a funding gap that can cause several government functions to be temporarily disabled.
So when the government fails to get funding through, government agencies can't get funded and their employees can't get paid.
But some essential agencies like the FBI, CIA, air traffic controllers, the Army, Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, the Postal Service, and the VA all remained open. So the government doesn't completely close, but is put on life support, with all non-essential government workers temporarily laid off or furloughed.
In the past, when a government shutdown happened, this was protocol. The House and the Senate would bicker over the bill, and many suffered. But there was hope that the suffering would end, and it wasn't the intention of the government. And there have been many shutdowns before the most current one. With the first one in 1980 under Jimmy Carter, when his attorney dug up the Anti-Defecation Act, an act which says that if Congress has not given the funds for federal agencies to run, then they can't run, leading to a 24-hour shutdown of the FTC to send a message to Congress.
I know, a whole day without a government agency? Can you imagine?
And so that's how it's been going for 40 years. The government shuts down after a budget can't pass, and the legislative branch works hard to come up with a new budget, while essential services that save people's lives remain open.
But not this time. So why is this government shutdown different? The most obvious reason this most recent shutdown is different is because of how long it is. 43 whole days. That's, and I don't know if this math will make sense, 43 times the length of the first shutdown in 1980. But there are other reasons as well. The central one you may or may not have heard of in the news is SNAP, Supplemental Nutrients Assistance Program, or the program that gives money to lower-income households to purchase food. While SNAP is considered a non-essential government agency, it also does have $6 billion in reserve funding from the Department of Agriculture in case of a situation like, I don't know, a government shutdown.
However, the Trump administration failed to provide a plan on how to fund SNAP in 2025, meaning that if a shutdown continued past October, then millions would go hungry.
Luckily, it did not, but this card that the White House pulled was unprecedented, and it shook the Democrats to their core.
Now, instead of a standoff for the pay and health care of federal workers, the administration could be endangering millions of lives.
Another major impact the Democrats had to weigh was that if the spending bill was passed, then millions of Americans and their health care could be at stake.
The budget bill that was being voted on included major cuts to Medicare and Medicaid, which would skyrocket the amount many Americans paid in health insurance a year, with cuts projected to hit people in rural and lower income areas the hardest.
Keep that in mind for later.
The stakes had been raised, and now the shutdown was turning into a standoff. And for 40 days, that's how it remained. Dems mulled over their options as the clock for funding slowly ticked down, and the Republicans continued to frame the shutdown as Democrat-made. They even put an official statement and tracker on the official White House website saying Americans don't agree with Democrats' actions.
The Republicans are trying to shift the message of the shutdown away from cuts to rural Americans and SNAP and more towards the Democrats gambling with people's lives for political capital. So how did Democrats respond?
With funding deadlines looming ever closer, the Democrats had to weigh their two options, with the two factions of the party supporting either one. Option one was to simply hold the line and wait for the Republicans to concede to some of their demands. The funding bill would be amended, and it could possibly lead to less healthcare cuts and loosen the Trump administration's grip on power.
It was high risk, high reward. SNAP benefits could expire, but the Democrats could finally get the major win that they had been looking for all across the Trump administration. Proponents of the hunker down option were people on the left of the party's wing,
including Bernie Sanders, Georgia Senator Jon Ossoff, and Pete Buttigieg. They perceived the shutdown as an ideological battle between the Trump administration and the Democratic Party, one which the Democrats had to win to prove that they were still the viable opposition party. Any funding bill passed without any clear amendments or changes would just be another win for the Trump administration. And until then, they just had to wait for something to give.
This faction also had the public on their side, as according to a Quinnipiac University poll, 45% of the public blamed the Republicans for the shutdown, not the Democrats. Meaning that, according to the hunker downers, if the shutdown kept going, it would be the Republican Party who suffered, not the Democrats.
The Democrats could finally show that they meaningfully cared about general affordability and the general public.
Great! Everyone wins, except the Republicans. While these ideas were shared by the base of the Democratic Party and some up-and-coming candidates, they were not at all shared by party leaders.
They preferred option 2, conceding the government shutdown in the hope for more longer-term benefits, and to save people from the aforementioned snap freeze. This plan was low risk, but low reward. The Democrats would be seen as capitulating to Republican demands by their base, but could still hope to sell it as the lesser of the two evils.
They could push for reforms down the road, like protecting the Affordable Care Act, and maybe
pick up voters who were dissatisfied with Republican leadership and cuts. Proponents of this plan included Senator and former vice presidential candidate Tim Kaine, Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman, and Senate Minority Whip, basically the minority's vice leader, Dick Durbin.
These establishment and more centrist Democrats hoped that by stemming the bleeding, they could take some credit for avoiding the disastrous impact and win votes down the line.
The compromisers frequently clashed with the hunker downers to try and get their vision implemented, and for a while there was hope in the Democratic base.
Maybe the leaders of the party could finally stop Trump and get some legislation passed, and maybe... Wait. They capitulated? Already? Shit!
On November 12th, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer released Democrats for voting on party lines, and 8 senators, including the ones I mentioned previously, voted to approve the funding bill in the hopes of avoiding the worst effects of the shutdown.
The base was not happy in the slightest.
Gavin Newsom, governor of California and professional shitposter, called the deal pathetic, with many progressive challengers running for election in 2026, including Graham Plattner of Maine and Zycod Chakrabarty of San Francisco, slamming both Schumer's leadership and the 8 senators who flipped and voted with Republicans. The spending bill was then passed by the House, and then Donald Trump signed it a day after.
The divide in the party was made very clear. Leadership was desperately trying to justify their actions to both the American public and their fellow party members, and the progressive wing was fighting back, with calls for the party to actually stand for something, for leadership to fight back, and even some calling for Schumer to step down. The shutdown is just one of many of the challenges the Democratic Party is facing right now, and it serves as a broader example of what's happening to the party post-2024. The two options of what to do during the shutdown represent the two halves of the Democratic Party. There's the moderate leadership, who still believes in bipartisanship and thinks that confronting the Trump administration head-on will only anger it more. The compromisers. And the more left-wing progressive insurgents, who believe attacking Trump and his administration is a way to preserve democracy. The hunker downers. These two internal factions have been wresting control of the party ever since the 2024 election ended, and have different plans on how to move forward. The shutdown is just one example of how these two perspectives are expressing themselves. The progressives see the moderates as deadweight, killing any meaningful opposition to the Trump administration, while the moderates see the progressives as too radical to be elected and too hostile to Trump and the executive branch. All over the country, we're seeing more moderate Democrats being pitted against more progressive challengers. Whether it be in New York with Mamdani versus Cuomo, San Francisco with Chakrabarty, or in Maine with Mills versus Plattner, progressives are in all-out revolt against the establishment and trying desperately to wrestle control of the party away from those who have been in charge of it for decades. The shutdown has endangered not just thousands, but millions of lives all across the country, as we see unprecedented action by the Trump administration and historic instability within the Democratic Party. This government shutdown was completely out of the ordinary, not just because of what it did to harm the American people, but outshook the Democratic Party to its very core.
No, wait.